Okay, I'm Jan Ozer. Thank you for coming. This is a session on encoding for iDevices. People who came in just a moment ago, the presentation is available online at streaminglearningcenter.com. It's the article on the upper left. Click that and you can download the PDF. If you're not on Wi-Fi yet, the Wi-Fi provider you want to select is InfoToday Wi-Fi, and the password is InfoToday, no caps. Okay, here's our agenda for the presentation. If you want to send video to iDevices, which is presumably why you're here, you'll have to use the H.264 video codec. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the codec, what you need to know to produce for Apple devices. And then we'll look at encoding for the iPhone and the iPad, actually the iPod as well. We're going to look at three different scenarios. We're going to look at tethered delivery via iTunes. We're going to look at single file streaming, which is really pretty easy. And then we're going to look at HTTP live streaming. And HTTP live streaming is an adaptive bitrate technology that's supported natively in the Apple operating system. So you don't have to do anything special. I do want to point out that while HTTP live streaming is kind of the default technology for sending video to iDevices via adaptive streaming, if you produce an app, you can use any of a number of technologies. So you can use Flash via RTMP, or you can use smooth streaming. So you have a number of options if you want to produce an app, two really diverse to talk about in this presentation. I'm going to focus on HTTP live streaming. So this is a browser-based operating system support, native, don't have to do anything special via an app, can just send it to any iPhone. So there's basically two scenarios. There's iTunes. How many people are producing for iTunes? Okay, don't need to. And how many people are interested mostly in HTTP live streaming and adaptive delivery to? Okay. How many people are not that familiar with what adaptive streaming is? And okay. All right, good. Okay, I just published a book. Book is $40 on Amazon. I'm selling limited copies here at the show at $20. So if you'd like to pick up a copy, everything that we're going to talk about in the presentation is going to be in the book. So as I said, it's pretty current as of April 2013. So what is H.264? H.264 is a video compression technology. Most iDevices can also play an older codec called the MPEG-4 codec, but that codec is much less efficient than H.264. When I say efficient, I mean higher data rate, lower quality. So if you're producing for iDevices, typically you're going to use the H.264 codec. And the reason is you get better quality, it's more widely playable, smaller file sizes. So that's why we're going to spend our time on the H.264 codec. We had a class yesterday. It was about a 3-hour session. We spent an hour on H.264 encoding configurations. So there's myriad options to produce H.264. Most of them relate to quality. Okay? Some of them relate to compatibility. So compatibility means it's going to play or it's not going to play. Quality means it may or might look better or worse, but it'll still play. So when you're producing for iDevices, of course you want maximum quality, but the areas that we're going to focus on relate to compatibility. How do you make sure the video file that you produce plays on the iDevice that you're targeting? And what you need to know there is the profile and the level of the device that you're targeting. If you choose the wrong profile or the wrong level, it's not going to play on your target device. Okay? So that's what we're going to focus on here, because that's the compatibility aspect, not the qualitative aspect. So what is an H.264 profile? That's a definition from Wikipedia. It's a set of encoding tools that, or algorithms that you can use to generate a bit stream. These are the algorithms and coding tools, and these are the profiles. And the profiles that we care about are three. There's baseline, main, and high. And what we see here is we see more of the tools and algorithms are used in the high profile, and fewer are used in the baseline profile. Now, what quality expectations would you have looking at this chart? Which profile would you think would deliver the best quality? High profile. And the difference probably is not as striking as you may believe. It's something we spent a lot of time on yesterday. But the quality of the high profile is going to be better. What do we assume the trade-off is going to be? What are the two possible detriments of using the high profile? OK, so it's CPU decode on the decoding side. So that's number one. The other one is potentially encoding time. We don't care so much about encoding time unless you're in a very high volume environment. But what you do care about is how hard the file is to produce. So why did the H.264 committee come up with different profiles? Because they wanted to create different versions of H.264 that different manufacturers could support with low-power CPU devices. So the original iPods and the original iPhones that came out only supported the baseline profile. So if you are producing videos for those devices, if you send them a video file that uses the high profile, it's not going to play. If you're doing it in an iTunes tethered situation, then the file just won't load. And if you're doing it in an online situation, it just won't play. So really, the key compatibility aspect of producing H.264 for iDevices is knowing the right profile to use. And then levels constrain key parameters in the bit stream. So levels will say, OK, you can't, at this particular profile, this level, you can't go higher than this data rate. You can't go higher than this resolution. And when you're producing for iDevices, you need to know all of those for every device that you're targeting. So this is the first chart. And again, this is available on the PDF that you can download. And if you're producing for iTunes, basically anybody can connect to iTunes, right? You don't need to have an iPhone 4S or an iPhone 5 or an iPad 3 or whatever they call it. So if you're producing for iTunes, we're going to take a quick look here and see, well, how many producers still support these people here using the original iPhone or the iPhone to version 4, which requires the baseline profile. OK? But if you're producing for streaming, if you're delivering the video via a website, I think a lot of producers are starting to say, well, we don't care about these guys. We just don't, we think that our users are going to be using the iPhone 4 and later. Any comments on that? Who's producing for streaming and what do we care about? What's our thought about how much of this we care about, the original iPhones to version 3 or version 4? Anybody still care about those? OK, so I think if you're producing for delivery via the web as opposed to iTunes, I think there's a lot of people who just don't care about even this group. How many people start at the iPhone 4S and go beyond? How many people don't care about anything before the iPhone 4S? Raise your hand. How many people care about phones before that? OK. Well, I think that's a decision everybody has to make, knowing who's viewing their videos. If you do care about this group here, then you're going to need to encode your video differently. OK, you're going to have to encode using the main profile. And if you want to deliver the highest possible quality for these devices here, which I think everybody cares about a lot, then you're going to want to use the high profile. So what this chart shows you is it divides all of the iDevices that Apple has shipped into categories by the level and the profile of H.264 video that they support. And you can see the devices up here, and then here's the levels. And it turns out that there's 5 basic groups. And if you basically just have to pick which ones you care about and then encode your video accordingly. OK, so let's start, and I'll go through this pretty quickly, but we'll look at iTunes first, and then we'll go to HTTP live streaming. So what are the decisions you have to make if you're distributing via iTunes? Decision one is, do you care about the older iPods that only play the 320 by 240 video? So if we look at the very oldest videos, or the very oldest devices, these guys here, it's 320 by 240, very, very tiny screen. Should you care about those when you're producing for iTunes? Decision two, you've got some pretty high specs on these devices here. You've got 1080p video that can play on an iPhone 5 and the new iPad. Should you produce two files, one for the iPhone 5 and the new iPad, and then a lower quality file for other devices? And we'll look and see what many producers are doing in that regard. Should you distribute multiple files? And again, should you distribute 1080p files to devices that support them? So what I did was I did a survey of iTunes. I downloaded 52 files, tried to get a good representation of three-letter networks, prominent technology sites like CNET and This Week in Tech and Revision 3. And these are all free. We'll cover TV shows and music videos in a second. And I got 17 from iTunes in the UK as well. OK, so question one, should you abandon 320 by 240? Of the 52 files that I downloaded in the United States, 6, including Oprah, Face the Nation, Techzilla, and the others that you can read, still supported 320 by 240. So if you're producing for iTunes, there are substantial producers who still care about the oldest class of iDevices. So I wouldn't say, you know who your audience is. There are very few of those devices out there, but some producers still care about them. In Europe, it was 2 out of 17. So again, if you're attempting to find the broadest possible audience, don't abandon those devices. Should you produce a single stream? 28 of the 52 podcasts were 640 by 480 or 640 by 360. For most producers, that was the only stream. So if you're producing for iTunes and you care about encoding time, you don't want to produce a lot of different files, I think 640 360 is, or 640 480 for 4:3 footage is, it's the most accepted resolution that you see out there. And that's not only true for iTunes, that's true for live streaming as well. I think 640 by 360 is the IBM of streaming. If you're producing at 640 by 360, you're okay. If you're any smaller, it's like, well, why aren't you 640 360? That's what CNN is. They can do it. Why can't you do it? If you're any bigger, it's like, well, why do you need to spend more money on bandwidth and be larger? Because 640 by 360 is obviously okay. And I saw that, again, I saw that with iTunes, and I saw that with live streaming. Should you distribute multiple files? I mean, the producers who distributed multiple files were typically tech sites, like Revision 3, CNET, and This Week in Tech. They seemed to do it just to prove that they could. Hey, we're a tech site. We got to cover it. Because we're experts at this. I don't know if they got a lot of benefit from it, because I'm sure most of their viewers are on newer gear, not older gear. So that was one class. And the other class were, people who were producing very compelling HD content. So some of the NASA space videos really benefit from HD, right? If it's talking head, if it's a news guy, nobody cares if it's HD or SD. On the other hand, if you've got photographs or videos of the stars, like the real stars, not the one in Hollywood, then you really do benefit from HD video. And if you're producing a screen cam, screen cams that are like this are just tough to read, right? You can't read the text, they're blurry. So those are the two areas of content that if I was producing for iTunes, I would do in HD. Otherwise, I think 640 by 360 or 640 by 480 is probably okay. And if you do go 720p, I think you have to think real hard about offering a lower quality, lower resolution stream. And then we saw that 1080p is starting to be supported by some of the higher, the new iPad supports 1080p. The old iPad, I guess the iPad 2 supports 1080p via a dongle out to a television set. The iPhone 5 supports 1080p. I didn't find any free content at 1080p. And we're going to see something interesting on the TV shows that was pretty startling. So everything up to this date is free, right? Nobody's paying for anything. This is just free content you can download from iTunes. Okay, again, you can download the presentation on my website. So these are music videos. So these are files I spent $2.50 for, and believe me, it wasn't because I like the music. But this is, these are current music videos available on iTunes, and it's interesting that none of them supported the oldest iDevices out there, but everybody supported, everybody was at baseline profile no larger than 640 by 480, 640 by 360. So what the music video producers said is, we don't care about these guys here, but we do care about these guys here. Okay? Every music video and every SD TV show that I saw on iTunes supported this class of device. Everybody used the baseline profile. Nobody went bigger than 640 by 480 resolution. The other thing that was interesting, I guess a couple things were interesting. Number one, if you look at the specs for the iDevices, and these are the specs from the Apple website, and every device maxes out at 160 kilobits per second for audio transferred with video. Some of them have higher specs for audio files only. But if you look at the device specs for the audio that comes with the video, it's all 160 kilobits per second. Every music video was produced at 256 kilobits per second. So even though it was exceeding the spec of those devices, they produced at higher quality and they all played, right? So there were no problems with producing at 256 kilobits per second. The other thing that was interesting is that these files are produced at 640 by 480. So if you looked at this, you'd say, okay, what are they doing? These 640 by 480 videos can't be shot in 4:3 resolution, right? I mean, nobody's shooting in Hollywood in 4:3 anymore. So you look at this and you say, well, what are they doing? What are you doing?
I'm trying to get the screen.
I'm kidding.
You just do your thing.
Okay. Okay, so here's Katy Perry, and this is an obscure compression thingy, right? So who here uses compressor? Yeah, I mean, not a lot of people use compressor, but this is the only tool that I know how to do this with. But they produced, so this is a 16 by 9 resolution, right? If you look in media info, you see that the height and width is 640 by 480. Okay, so the actual pixels are 640 by 480 resolution. But when they display it, it's displayed at 853 by 480 to give it the 16 by 9 look. So what they did was they compressed at 640 by 480, but they used a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, so when it displays out at 853 by 480. So what do they get for that? They get a 16 by 9 presentation, which is what they want, but they also get compatibility with iDevices that can only play 640 by 480 or smaller. So the physical resolution of the file is 640 by 480. The display resolution is 853 by 480. So it's a pretty cool way to maintain compatibility with the older devices and still get a 16 by 9 look. Okay, so here's kind of the interesting progression that I saw in HD TV. So this is 2011, and a lot of people were at 720p, and a lot of people were at 960 by 720 and did the same aspect ratio thingy to get the 1280 by 720. Okay, so we moved to 2012, and there were still some 720p episodes. No big change there. But we also go to 2012, and we see a lot of videos are starting to be produced on iTunes at 1080p. So pretty much every major TV show that I could find was produced at 1080p. And this, again, is October of 2012. And I made the conclusion that paid HDTV episodes seem to be moving to 1080p. And then when I checked in the last week or so, everybody's back at 720. And I have no idea why. But that was, everybody who was producing at 1080p is now back at 720p. I have no idea why, but the last time I gave this presentation, it was like, you need to seriously consider 1080p. And now it's like, well, they kind of moved away from that. And I think, I think in most applications, although who has a new iPad? Anybody? How's 1080p look at that compared to like the older iPod? Yeah, I mean, it's on that particular device, and probably that particular device only, I think it's a pretty significant difference. So I think Hollywood kind of got really enamored by that device, and and started publishing for it quickly, and then they just backed off. And I have no idea why, but it was something significant, so I thought I would mention it. These are the trends in paid content. And then this is SDTV. You can still buy SDTV episodes. These are all, again, 640 by 480. They use the same Katy Perry trick that we saw to extend out to 16 by 9 during playback. So these are the SDTV episodes. And you know, it's interesting, if we look at the data rates here, this is 640 by 480. It's around 1.5 megabits per second. If we look at the data rate here, these are 720p. We're at an average of around 4.1 megabits per second. And then here, the 1080p is 5 megabits a second. And the 720p episodes going back are at 4 here and then 4 here as well. I just wanted to give you some idea about what data rates people were using at these resolutions. Okay, so let's kind of bring this home to some recommendations. If you are producing podcasts at 320 by 240 or 320 by 180, the device maximum is 768 kilobits per second. The data rate average in the group that I analyzed in my survey was around 532 kilobits per second. So I would recommend, there's no real reason to push this data rate since you get pretty good quality at the 532. The maximum for the device was 128 kilobits per second, and the data rate most people use was 95 kilobits per second. So if you're producing for this resolution, I recommend using the parameters here. If you're producing at this resolution, the device maximum is 2.5 megabits per second. This is the second category that we looked at. The average of producers in the free podcast was around 1.139 as compared to 2.5 megabits per second. The average data rate on the audio was all stereo, but it was 113 kilobits per second compared to the maximum of 128. And here's where those numbers come into play. And this is pretty important. If you're producing 720p video, the average I saw in my free iTunes podcast was around just under 3 megabits per second. The maximum is 14 megabits per second, and a lot of encoding tools produce at the maximum. So if you pull a preset from Compressor, for example, and you say, I want to compress for iTunes at 720p, the data rate they use is 14 megabits per second. So even the 720p TV shows that we looked at were at 4 megabits per second, right? So if Hollywood says 4 megabits per second is fine for 720p, you don't need to throw 14 megabits per second at it. Okay, so if I'm producing for iTunes delivery, I'm going to use somewhere between the 3 and the 4 megabits per second, not the 14. Okay, any questions on iTunes? I don't think it matters, but I think most people are using the M4V. So the question was which format, M4V or MP4? So MP4, if you see an MP4 file, what does that mean? That means it's a file using the MPEG-4 container format. If you see an M4V file, that means it's Apple's kind of variant off of the MPEG-4 container format for iTunes. So there's not a lot of major differences in the file.
So if I have to support other devices, I can stay with MP4.
Yeah, I think, and that's the good point. So if you want to create one file that plays everywhere, the MP4 file is going to be a lot more compatible than the M4V or an F4V or any other variant that's out there on the MPEG-4 on the H.264 spec. Okay, so the question is, does Compressor allow you to produce the file that's the 4:3 with displays at 16 by 9? Compressor does that, and that's the Compressor can do that. I've tried that with a lot of other tools. I'm sure you can make most of them work, but anybody do that? Anybody try that? Well, that's how DV works, and that's how DV work with widescreen and 4:3. But I guess his question is, if you want to produce a 640 by 480 to make sure it plays on those older devices, what tools can you use to do that? And I know you can do it in Compressor. I've played around with some other tools, but I haven't really, Say it again? I'm not familiar with that. Is that a free tool or a? Okay.
I think you can do it in Adobe Medium,
Yeah, you may be able to, but I just haven't. Really what you have to do is you gotta set the target resolution, and then you gotta set the aspect ratio. And I'm sure if you play with it, you can make it work in most encoding tools. So we talked about 3 scenarios. One scenario is iTunes. We covered that. One scenario is single file streaming to iOS devices. You want to put a video on your web page and have every iPhone play it. And if all you're doing is single file streaming and you don't need, you're not doing adaptive, you're not doing live, you don't need DRM, you don't need captioning, then HTML5 with an H.264 file works fine. Every iDevice can play HTML5, every iDevice can play H.264 video. So if all you need is a single file, it's relatively simple to do. Just use HTML5, put it on a website with Flash fallback, so anything that hits it, if it can't play HTML5 with H.264, it'll fall back to Flash, and that's how you get most of your computers that don't have HTML5 browsers with H.264 capabilities. So that's a pretty simple scenario. The scenario that I think most people are moving to is adaptive streaming, and spend a little bit of time talking about adaptive streaming and then cover how HTTP live streaming works, and then we'll talk about transmuxing. Who knows what transmuxing is? Okay, really fun technology. Great name, and it's a great application. Okay, so the concept of adaptive streaming is you have one source file, whether it's live or on demand, and you create multiple iterations of that file. So you have multiple files available to your target viewers, and then you vary the file that's distributed to the viewer based upon changing conditions, which in the case of iDevices is only the buffer. So the buffer is what, it's like a little bucket at the playback device that has the video files that's being downloaded. So if the bucket is high, the iDevice says, well, life is good, let's try a higher quality file. So all the iDevice looks at is the buffer. In contrast, Flash and smooth streaming also look at CPU utilization, right? So they'll monitor 2 things. iDevices only monitor the buffer because I think they've done the work up front, and they say, well, if you send a main profile video to an iPad, it's going to play. We don't need to worry about it because that's why we said main profile only. So the iDevices monitor the buffer, and then if there's plenty of buffer, they say, well, let's try a higher quality file. If the buffer goes down to disturbing levels, then it'll say, well, we may drop frames here. We may stop playback if we don't get a lower quality file. So send me a lower quality file. The data rate's smaller. It'll get here quicker. The buffer will fill up, and we'll continue playback. And all that's transparent to the viewer. So we know that YouTube's style of adaptive streaming is, pick the stream you want. A little button on the bottom right side of the player. Adaptive streaming is all transparent to the viewer. So once you click the website with your iDevice, all that change of streams, all the monitoring of the buffer happens behind the scenes. Nothing that the viewer needs to worry about. What do we like about HTTP live streaming? HTTP live streaming is Apple's technology, and it's really kind of funny because everybody, the iPhone had so much penetration very early on, and Apple did such a wonderful job documenting the HTTP live streaming spec that every producer who was producing video said, okay, I need Flash on the desktop and HLS. And everybody started supporting HLS. So when Android came out, they said, well, we don't want to create a new technology. We'll support HLS too. And although anybody who's tried it knows it's imperfect, Android supports HLS from 3.0 and beyond. OTT devices like the Roku box, obviously the Apple box, Boxee, and others, Google TV, they all support HLS as well. Why? Because they didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and Apple did such a great job with putting HLS together. And then the JW player is a prefab Flash player you can buy and use on your website. So this is for website development. It's a third-party tool. A lot of people use it. And What JW Player did a few months ago is say, we are going to support HLS playback in our tool. So if you are a website developer and you use the JW Player, you can build a Flash player on your website that plays HLS streams. So all of a sudden, HLS plays on all Apple devices, Apple TV included. It plays on all OTT devices. If it's your website and you choose the JW Player or any other player that also supports HLS, you can get playback in Flash as well. So you get desktop, you get iOS, you get OTT via one standard. And that's a pretty compelling proposition. What other acronym do we know that promises to deliver that? Dash. And the problem with Dash, of course, is it doesn't give you Android, it doesn't give you iOS, it doesn't give you desktop, and it doesn't give you OTT. Other than that, so I mean, so that's, and I'm being flip, but I mean that's kind of the state of where things are today. Is if you wanted to go HLS only, you could license the JW Player and get playback in any browser that supported Flash. You could get OTT, you could get iOS devices, and Android would be the only problem because Android doesn't play HLS streams effectively. There's aspect ratio issues and other issues. So with Android, the best solution today is to create an app, actually, and then use Flash technology. The other alternative, recently announced by Adobe, is a technology called Primetime. Primetime is anybody heard of Primetime? Okay, so Primetime is a technology that sits above the Flash player and adds, interestingly, in June or sometime this summer, it will add HLS playback. So if you will be able to license technology from Adobe that gives you HLS playback above Flash on the desktop. And and this is probably the biggest part of Primetime, or the most interesting, they are also supplying an HLS SDK for Android that will successfully play HLS streams. They are rewriting what they call the HLS stack within Android to make it work properly. So what Primetime is saying, and it costs money. None of this comes standard with the Flash player. You have to license Primetime, and so it's going to cost you money. But if you're distributing your content and you want to use HLS over all the platforms, you should be able to do that. But this is, so we're here to talk about encoding for iDevices, but if you encode for HLS, then you get potentially all the screens that are out there except for Android. Great question. Is Apple charging encoder vendors?
There's a separate H.264.
So I don't think they are. I mean, I could be wrong on that. And you're correct. There is a separate H.264 license. But I think, so what they do charge for are things like ProRes, but I don't think they're charging for HLS. They've submitted that as a standard, which that doesn't really mean they're not going to charge for it. But as far as I know, they're not, and some people are agreeing. Okay, so how does HLS work? Here's the live stream. That goes into the media encoder. Goes into a stream segmenter that produces a manifest file and multiple chunks of files. That's sent to an HTTP server where it's distributed to the viewers. How does the structure work? And this is really elegant because before HLS and I guess smooth streaming, all adaptive streaming technologies were server-based, right? So you needed a persistent connection between the server and the player. So a server had to say, well, how are you doing out there? And the player would say, well, things are looking grim. We should drop to a lower quality file. And then the server sent the lower quality file. What's the problem with that? That required RTMP or something that wasn't HTTP, so it got blocked by firewalls. Servers cost money, so it was a more expensive solution. It didn't scale well because if you didn't have the server capacity, you couldn't communicate with the player. And I don't know who came first. It was either Microsoft or Apple. Microsoft with smooth streaming or Apple with HLS. But they came up with this manifest file structure where you've got an M3U8 file here, and this contains the address of the alternative files. And the player, when you send the player a link, you send them a link to this. And you say, OK, start here. So the player starts here, and it retrieves the first chunk, low01.ts. And then it monitors the buffer while that's being played back. And then the player says, well, OK, things are good. Let's try for a higher quality file. It checks this file here. It sends it to this file here. And then it retrieves mid02.ts here. And the player's doing all the work. The player's monitoring. The player's doing all the work. This is all on a standard HTTP web server. It doesn't require a streaming server. And so the player's in charge of everything. There's no server involvement at all. Very elegant, very simple. Now, the original structure used different chunks of files. I mean, if you've heard of the chunked file and adaptive streaming, this is what they're talking about. Later technologies, including iOS 5 and smooth streaming and HTTP dynamic streaming from Adobe, they use a single file with what's called byte range requests. So you can request just a location within that file. You don't need to chunk it up. And that's simpler because instead of hundreds of thousands of files for a long event, you have one file with just byte range requests in that file. So the original HTTP technologies were all chunked. They've kind of moved into this byte range request, but it works the same way. So is there more granularity with the byte range? I think it's still a fit, because you still have to set the keyframe and the chunk size. And those things, that controls, the chunk size is what the player can retrieve. And whether that's in separate segments or a byte range request, I think that's fit. OK, so there's a couple of issues when you're producing for adaptive streaming. The first one, kind of the logistical issues of stream count and configuration. How many streams, what resolutions, what data rates are you going to use? And then once you understand that, it's OK, well, how do we encode adaptive streams differently than we produce single files? OK, so one is, how do we come up with stream configuration? Two is, how do we make sure that we encode this correctly, from an encoding perspective? What do we do differently? OK, again, you can download this handout at my website. This is a screen grab from the Rosetta Stone of HTTP live streaming, which is Apple TechNote TN2224. Who here has seen TechNote 2224? This is probably the best thing Apple's ever done for producers who are trying to produce for adaptive streaming. And you can find it at, you can either Google Apple TechNote TN2224, or you can find it at this bit.ly address. What they did is they basically said, OK, we got a bunch of people out there trying to produce for adaptive streaming for Apple devices. Why don't we just give them some suggestions? And so they came up with suggestions for both 16:9 and 4:3 aspect ratios. And that's what you see here. This is the 16:9 aspect ratio. And then over here on the left-hand side, they kind of divided up by target. These are the streams that we're targeting for cellular delivery. And these are the streams we're targeting for Wi-Fi delivery. And you see the resolutions here, the frame rates here, total bit rate, video bit rate, audio bit rate. A couple of notes while we're here. Apple recommends using the same audio parameters for every stream in the adaptive group. Okay, so if you're producing an 8.5 megabit per second 1080p stream for new iPads, and you're producing a 416 by 234 stream for the oldest iPhone, they say use 64 kilobits per second. Some producers do this, some producers don't do this, but that's obviously Apple's recommendation. Apple also recommends, and this is more than a recommendation, this is kind of essential, use the same keyframe interval. So why is the keyframe, it's kind of a fun question, why is the keyframe interval here at 90, but here it's at 30 to 36, and here 36 to 45? Is that the same interval or not? It's based on the frame rate. Okay, so the frame rate here is 10 to 12 frames per second. Apple says if you're producing a low bit rate file for adaptive streaming, use a small resolution and also drop the frame rate down to be between 10 and 12 frames per second. And if you do the math, if it's 10, then a keyframe every 30 frames is every 3 seconds. And at 30 frames per second here, which this assumes, you've got a keyframe every 90 frames or every 3 seconds. So you absolutely need a keyframe in the same location in every file you produce. Why is that? Why do you need a keyframe at the exact same location? Pardon? Okay, because they switch at keyframes. And playback has to start at a keyframe. If you switched on a B frame is, refers to a bunch of different frames that may not even be in that group. So you absolutely need a keyframe at the start of every, you need a keyframe at the same location in each file. And if you're creating chunked files, or even byte range request files, you need a keyframe at the start of every chunk size. Because if you get a chunk and there's no keyframe at the start of that chunk, the video can't play. Okay, so I'm not saying, if you look at what producers do, some producers follow this religiously. And by producers, I mean like 3-letter networks, people who've got highly paid people to figure this stuff out. They just use this at the lower resolutions. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying, if I'm going into this and if I'm consulting with the client says, what resolution should I use? I'm like, here's TNN 22224. This is where we should start. And then at least at the lower range, in the class yesterday we talked about, we're creating files here not only for iOS delivery, we're creating files for desktop delivery. So at least in the mid-range, I want to produce streams that match the window sizes of my website, right? So if I have a 732 by 480 window size, I want a stream in here that matches that window size. And that's my consideration at the upper levels. But at the lower levels, a lot of people just follow what Apple recommends. And again, Apple produces a lot of streams. Why not follow what they recommend? What do we do to make sure the files play? The keyframe interval, we kind of covered this a few seconds ago. Keyframe must be the first frame of every chunk. So the keyframe interval must divide evenly into the chunk duration. Sorensen Squeeze has a really nice interface for this. So this is 8.5. They're now up to 9. So they've got adaptive bitrate presets for Adobe HTTP, that's HDS, Apple HLS, Microsoft Smooth Streaming, and Dash. I'm not sure what Dash actually does. But here's how they do it. They say you select the keyframe interval. These are all the various file iterations here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. And you select one keyframe interval for all files. And you select your fragment duration here. So it's a pretty elegant way to do it. And also you choose one audio file parameter for all those files as well. So this just kind of highlights the point that you want to use a consistent keyframe interval for every file that you encode, and the keyframe interval has to divide evenly into the chunk size. Typically, to be conservative, I recommend that you disable scene change detection in your encoding tool. Why? Because some encoders will, if you find a scene change at frame 20, it may restart the keyframe interval, in which case you won't have a keyframe at the start of the chunk, so I recommend disabling scene change detection unless you know that your encoder doesn't do that. In terms of bitrate control, CBR is a more conservative approach. If you look at the white papers produced by Adobe, by Akamai, by others, they recommend using CBR or constant bitrate encoding, not VBR. On the other hand, if you look at what most producers do, most producers are producing using VBR. So when I work with a consultant, when I work as a consultant, my biggest priority is making it work and making it work reliably. So I typically use either CBR or very highly constrained VBR, like maybe 1.25, constrain the maximum data rate to 1.25. So here's what that would look like in Squeeze. I would choose a target data rate of, say, here's 2-pass VBR. I would choose a data rate of, say 500 to keep it simple. Actually, one. So if I choose a data rate of 1 megabit per second, and I know this is hard to see, I constrain the maximum data rate to 125% of that, so that's 1.25 megabits per second. So CBR is the most conservative. Constrained VBR is the next best thing. Most producers are using constrained VBR. Why are they using constrained VBR? Because in some instances, CBR, which is shown on the left, can produce ugly frames. So this is a VBR stream here, variable bitrate encoding. The data rate adjusts to the complexity of the video. On the left, it's a CBR stream, much more consistent, much less variability. But on this particular frame, where the camera is switching from a top-down view of the artboard to a front view of the artist, so it's a pretty big transition, although it doesn't look like a lot of motion here. The VBR had the data rate to handle it, and the CBR didn't. Now, I will say this is the most extreme differential I've ever seen between CBR and VBR. So I'm not saying if you use CBR, your video will look like this, and if you use VBR, it'll look much better. But this can happen. But this is the most extreme by far that I've ever seen between the difference between VBR and CBR. So again, if I'm using VBR, I'm going to use anywhere between 125 to 150. Some producers, MTV goes 200% VBR, and they're not experiencing problems. So that's kind of the practice out there. We saw on Apple Tech Note that Apple recommends using the same audio parameters for every file in the adaptive group. A lot of producers don't do that. I recommend that if you're going to switch, you keep the kilohertz the same, you keep the bits the same, and you just switch between mono and stereo. Problems sometimes happen when you change. If you jump from 22 to 44 or 22 to 48, you can have problems, but I think you get the least chance of any kind of popping artifact by jumping from 64-bit, 44, 16-bit mono to stereo at the same parameters. And again, the most conservative approach is use the same parameters for all files. I think that works for a talking head video. On the other hand, if you're producing a concert or a ballet where the music is a really big part of the experience, I think you really want the audio to improve with the video. Talk a little bit about transmuxing. Most producers are going to target Flash on the desktop, maybe Silverlight for some producers, and then mobile they're going to target HLS. 3 or 4 years ago, you had to produce 2 sets of files, one for Flash, one for iOS or HLS. Now what we're seeing are technologies that can take one set of files and transmux to another format. When I say transmux, what I'm saying is they're using the same encoded video and audio files, so they're changing the container format and creating any manifest files as necessary to support the different technologies. So the first server-based solution that we saw was from Wowza, who's here at the show, and they were able to tape a number of formats in, and they're not re-encoding here, right? They're using the same encoded H.264 streams, and whether it's a single stream or multiple adaptive streams, and they're transmuxing, changing the container format to send it out to any number of devices. Okay, so if you're producing for multiple targets, transmuxing is a very useful technology. And Wowz is here at the show. If this is something you want to learn about, I think it's a great opportunity to learn from them. There are also some other technologies that do this. Wowza, Microsoft does it with their iOS server. They can accept a smooth stream in, transmux that to Apple format. Real with the Helix server can do it. Adobe can do it with the Adobe Media Server family of servers as well. There are some service providers like Akamai. They call it in-the-network repackaging. You send Akamai an RTMP stream. They can repackage that for iOS delivery, transmux it to an MPEG-2 transport stream, create the necessary manifest files, no re-encoding, very efficient solution. The only thing is, we saw that this goes back to the whole thing about high profile versus baseline profile. OTT devices can play high profile, computers can play high profile. The lowest connected devices are still at baseline or main. So if you want to transmux, you have to use one set of files, which means typically you're going to have to use, so what Apple would say is, produce your lower quality files using the baseline profile, and then, potentially, you're not going to have a lot of computers connecting to these files anyway, right? Because computers are going to be Wi-Fi or wired. So you use the baseline profile for these that are typically only going to go to mobile, and then use the main and the high profiles for files that are typically only targeted at much higher quality or much higher power devices. So for transmuxing, are you recommending one or two profiles? I think I would start at the Apple recommendation, and I think what they put out a nice a nice schema, right? It's like use the baseline for the lower quality files. Some computers may get them, but typically it's only going to be mobile devices, and those are the only files that will play on those devices. But you want to create one set of files, and if you create one set of files that use the Apple recommendations, and I wouldn't, the highest, the 1080p recommendation is 8,500 megabits or kilobits per second. It's way high. But I think their schema is baseline for the mobile files, then main, and then high for the high quality files. And I think one set of files that's kind of in that schema should work pretty well for transmuxing. So what's the minimal set of targets you can do to make every device happy? And you're starting with 1080p, 720p?
1080p, 30 megabits.
So the way I kind of covered this yesterday is and again, I'm not saying this is the be all and end all, but I think the analysis that you have to do is you have to say, okay, how low do I want to go? What's the minimum cellular device I want to support? Do I care about 300 kilobits per second? Do I care about 400 kilobits? And that kind of sets your floor. And then if you're distributing your video in a window, in a browser window, I think you need some streams that match that browser window. So you have maybe 2 or 3 here. You have streams in here that match the browser window. And then you have the full screen or the OTT streams. And then I think here it's more of a cost factor. How much can I afford? Can I afford a stream at 8.5 megabits or 6.5 megabits per second? And then I think you have to look at what a lot, so yesterday we saw that Turner, for their NBA subscription service, produced maybe 15 or 16 streams. And I can, that presentation is online. You can download that. I think you can get away with fewer, but you have to make the decision. Some producers say, okay, I don't want to send baseline, even though these streams won't be played by a lot of computers, I don't want to send a baseline stream to a computer because the computer can play a high profile stream. But what I've seen, and there's research on my website, you can see it referred to in the handout from yesterday, which you can download on my website. I've seen not so much difference between baseline and main, or baseline and high. It's not like it's a quantum difference. Like, oh my goodness, this video is ugly, versus, oh my goodness, this video looks great at these parameters. Does that answer your question? Good question. So how does this work with live? I mean, what happens is the manifest file continually updates. So you just keep sending a new manifest file up, and then the player plays the chunk, and the next time it checks, there's an updated manifest file that supplies the updated information. So the manifest contains the addresses for all the chunks. So the main M3U8 contains the addresses for the sub-manifest files, and then the sub-manifest files for each stream contains the addresses of either the byte range requests or the. Good question. So is there a performance impact from having the streams too close so they switch too frequently. And some people say yes. I think it's more of my concern is more of the viewer perception. I think if there's too much stream switching going on, the viewer gets a sense of that, and it's a lower quality experience. So if you select your adaptive streams and you say, okay, I've got 15 streams and some are 150 kilobits per second apart, I think you just drop streams. I think you need to set up your streams so that there's a meaningful difference in quality of the experience between each level. Okay, good question. So which H.264 codec is the best? I mean, avoid Apple. Apple's clearly the worst. And X.264, if you look at the Russian study, the University of Moscow puts out a codec survey every year. X.264 has traditionally been the highest. Main Concept claims that with their latest version they have gotten parity. I haven't tested it yet, so I don't know. But all that's on demand. So on the live side, I think there's a lot closer grouping. If you take Apple out of the picture, I don't think quality is a major differentiation between any of the reputable products. Okay, let's deal with that after. Let me let everybody go. So, and anybody who has any questions, we've got a few minutes before the next speaker comes in.